Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to teach you how to easily read a cross stitch pattern. Now, generally when you get a pattern, you will get something called a color copy of the pattern and a symbols pattern. Each of those should come with the color code to the floss, have a key that shows what color corresponds to what floss number or what symbol corresponds to which floss number, as well as what brand of floss you need. Patterns will always come on a grid, usually with numbers at the top and sides marking each square, but sometimes the numbers are just in 5s or 10s. These numbers show you how large the project is overall and allow you to calculate what size Aida cloth you want to use. Aida cloth is also a grid and comes in various counts, which is how many squares per inch. In this instance, the pattern is 68 stitches wide by 69 inches tall. Patterns also have these kind of bolded squares, which are usually 10 by 10 stitches to make the pattern easier to read, but each individual square of your Aida cloth is going to correspond to a square on your pattern. This will also help us figure out what size Aida we want to use. To do this, you divide the Aida count by the number of stitches on each axis of the pattern. If I wanted to use 16 count for this pattern, I would do 68 divided by 16 and 69 divided by 16, which ends up being about 4.25 by 4.25 inches. But once we know that, how do we know where to start stitching? Well, the rule of thumb for me is you always want to start in the middle of the pattern. This helps your pattern stay centered in your hoop from the get-go, so you don't have to worry about running out of cloth because you started in the wrong spot. On my patterns, I always make red guidelines to show the center point of the patterns I create. Where they converge is going to be our starting point to figure out where we should stitch on our fabric. As you can see, I've marked my center box and I'm counting up until I come to our first colored box. That box represents a green cross stitch and it is the 4th box up from the center. This will be our first stitch. So we're going to mark up 1, 2, 3, and that box is 4. That's our first stitch right there. I'm going to mark it just so we don't get lost. So now let's get our fabric ready. The easiest way to find center in your fabric is to just fold it in half hot dog style and then one more time in the hamburger style. This will give you a good idea where center should be. And now that we have those little indents, we can get our fabric in our working hoop. There's our center point, here's our hoop. Open up the rings, lay the fabric on top, and then the outer ring on top of that. Push down. Now for beginners, I recommend actually marking your center square. You can do this with a water-soluble pen. They're usually in the sewing section of craft stores and the marks removed with water. You can also use a heat erasable pen. Fair warning, heat erasable pen on white fabric can sometimes leave a little residue, but I'm not bothered by that right now, so I will use it to mark our center and remove the mark with a hairdryer when I'm finished with it. Now, if you can't bear the thought of marking up your fabric, and no judgment, a lot of people can't, you can always make yourself a starting cross that you'll remove when you no longer need it. I'm going to use a loop start and just make a little cross to show you how, remembering that in the fabric, I'm going to assign the top left box of the cross as my center square. So there's my loop, and I will finish up my cross. And then at the end, when I no longer need it, I will just remove these stitches. Now to secure the cross, I'm just going to flip it and run this under the stitches on the back side and then cut off the tail. Snip. So let's get back to the actual pattern. Remember we said we were going to have that green square be our first stitch, so you need to thread that floss color into your needle. For patterns like this with a lot of color changes, I don't use long lengths of floss, just enough to get the section done. Now back to the pattern, we are going to count twice and stitch once. So yes, it is 4 boxes up from center, and this is going to be our starting point. We are then going to go to our starting square on the fabric and count up 4 boxes to know where to stitch. Then we make a diagonal stitch. I'm going to begin using a loop start, and if you want a more in-depth look at that, I have another video on how to do that. Once we have our first diagonal, I'm going to consult my pattern again to see which box to stitch next. So next to the first green square, I see there are two more to the left of it in the same row, and that's where I'll move next. Now, some people like to finish each cross stitch as they go, which is making the X's as they go, and some just do diagonals first. I do both, and I really think it's just important to figure out which works best for you, but you want to remember to keep the same level of tension on your stitches, and either method is fine. In this case, I'm going to keep going with my diagonals. After I finish my first row, I'll consult the pattern again and move down one row from where I was working, seeing that it starts one box down and to the left, and from there I need 3 more cross stitches going towards the left side of my fabric. On the third row, it's the same. I move down one row and to the left to start my cross stitches. There's 3 of them, and it's going to the left. Again, everyone reads patterns and stitches a little bit differently. It's important to figure out what is going to work best for you, because when you first start out, this can be a little daunting. But doing counted cross stitch is super good for your brain because it can get really meditative. When you start counting stitches, it's very unlikely you'll be thinking about anything else, which can be great for anxiety. That being said, it can get frustrating when you miscount, so again, count twice and find a system that works for you. There are multiple ways to read patterns, and if you read them in a way that is frustrating to you, this probably won't be a hobby you stick with. There is no one right way to stitch, and in this video, I'm showing you how my brain works and how I digest patterns. Once I have all my diagonals, I will then go back and finish them into completed cross stitches. Each X is a cross stitch. When you reach the end of your floss color, we're going to turn our work around and run our needle under the back side of a few stitches to secure and then cut off the tail of the floss. This is going to secure your thread, and now we can move to the next section. Now, because this can be challenging and doesn't work for everyone, here's another method if you find basic counted cross stitch too hard when starting out. Remember how we said each box in bold is 10 by 10 stitches? Well, there isn't anything that says you can't actually mark boxes on your fabric. So if you started stitching and it's too hard, just make the grid on your fabric using those pens we talked about earlier. And you can use the stitches you've already made as a guide. That way you can work within a smaller square, which will ease the mental load of looking at a huge pattern to just looking at one box. So I can see that bold line cuts off this last square on our third row, and from there it's 4 stitches up to the corner of our 10 by 10 square. And don't forget, always count twice. As I'm making these marks, I'm double counting, but my box looks a little off, and that's because my particular piece of Aida cloth has a little bit wider of squares than normal. But I've double counted, it is correct. And now I have multiple points of reference. I have my middle box and 4 lines I can work off of. So looking at the far right vertical line, I see I need to go up from the corner, and then I have a yellow cross stitch to make on the third square. From that starting point, there are 2 more above it in the same color. When I'm done with that column, I can move to the left and keep working the pattern within my box, or move to the right and go outside of the box. I'm going to keep it simple and just fill in our square for now, reading the pattern from right to left in columns. Okay, now that we've done the basics, let's look at the symbols pattern. I love symbols patterns with numbers or letters because for me they are easier to read, but a lot of patterns just use random symbols like arrows or dots. On my patterns, I generally use letters. You read the pattern the same exact way, but each box on the pattern will show a symbol or letter that will signify which color to use. This is really useful for patterns that have a ton of different colors or colors that are very similar and may be difficult to distinguish which color is which easily. So when in doubt, always check your symbols pattern. And finally, the last thing we'll look at are these horizontal lines that can also show up on a pattern. When you see lines on a pattern, that is representing something called backstitch. These are diagonal, horizontal, or vertical lines in your floss. So in our case, the original leaf we did, we can see that from the left side upper corner of our cross stitch, if we move up 2 boxes, we get our first back stitch. We are going to start that stitch in the upper left corner, and we need to go up 2 vertical boxes for our end point. And again, if you get confused, you can just mark it if you need to. This is our diagonal, but back stitch can also be horizontal or vertical, and I'm going to show you just a little demonstration of that as well. Now, if you have any other questions, just let me know. I know this is a lot to digest, but thanks for making it this far, and I hope it was helpful.